Thank you, Professor Asma, for the enlightening speech. It was a very brief but very comprehensive survey of a range of scholarly thought, especially with regards to the differences between the hardline Islamist and the modernist pertaining to key constructs such as Sharia, Islamic State, and jihad. Seems like the problem with the conceptualization of the Sharia is more about conflating the fiqh, which is the time-bound understanding, human understanding of certain concepts of Islam, with the divinely inspired Sharia principles. So there is a confusion there. In regards to the Islamic State, the question is about political authority. Is there any room or agency for human beings? Or is it only absolutist compliance and blind following? And with regards to the jihad, which is the most controversial issue nowadays, the question is about whether the jihad is hijacked and militarized, or the concept of jihad is more about the spiritual area of human endeavors. So with this, I would like to pass the stage to Professor Dato Ahmad Farouk for the moderation of the next session. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to officially welcome Prof. Asma Asfaruddin. I mean, it was a pleasure reading your book and translated by our fellow husband Bahrum, Prof. Clive Kessler, as usual. He'll be very provocative today. I expected him to. And Prof. Jeffrey Kenney, my friend from DePaul University. I think we have this topic about the future of Islam because this book is very relevant to that. I believe that we are at this intersection, an intersection where the future of Islam depends basically on this, what they call, war of ideas between the different ideologies within the Muslim community. So Prof had mentioned about the hardline Islamists on one hand, and on the other hand would be the modernists or the liberals, the so-called liberals. But I think there's one more trend which is very strong, especially in this part of country. I term them as the revisionist, or some would call them as the Wahhabis or Salafis. So I use a more subtle term as a revisionist. I think that, the way the history of what Prof had written in her book of the first Muslims, this defines on how we understand the seerah and how we understand the Salaf al-Salih, their lifetime and their achievements and their struggle and their establishment of a caliphate at that time. And I think this is a real challenge nowadays between these three factions, right? Between these three factions. I mean, I would say that the traditionalists would probably fall into the Islamist, even though they're not hardline Islamists, but yeah, they're the traditionalists. And we have that, many traditionalists in this country. And we know that these warring factions are, never ending. And in the end, the future Islam is going to be defined by who's the winner. It's just like the defeat of the people of reason before, the Mu'tazilah before, to the people of tradition, to the Ashaira. And that has led to me, and we have translated the book by this Robert Rayleigh, is called The Closing of the Muslim Minds. Yeah, we translated that because we felt that, that book to me and to us in the IRF is so important. It basically defines why we are in this kind of situation in the 21st century, right? We could have turned to become a world power in science and economy and in everything, right? But what had led us to become very static, very dogmatic in understanding the human world is because of the death of reason. And in that book particularly, and I wrote the preface to that book to basically to explain the problem that I said before, when even though you quoted Ghazali in a very positive manner, I saw him, differently when he basically promoted the idea of occasionalism, meaning to say that when you put a cotton close to fire, the cotton burns not because of fire, but because God wanted it to burn, either directly or through His intermediaries, so through His angels. So I think that's the idea that people in this particular part of the country, I don't know about the other side of the world, but in this part of the country, people still believe in that. People still believe that one person can be here and can be in Johor Bahru at the same time, because God is able to do that. That's what it's all about. It's not rationalism. So I think it's the death of rationalism, and that is causing the problem in this current world. Yeah. With that, I think I would like to first invite Professor Clive Kessler. Are you okay with that? Yeah. All right. Sure. All right.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you once again to the Islamic Renaissance Front for inviting me. I'm amazed at their tolerance that I keep saying the wrong thing and I keep getting invited back. So it just shows you there are some open-minded people. We have just heard a truly magisterial exposition by Professor Asma of perhaps the most important questions for our time, certainly for our time as Muslims experience and address and face it. It's an exposition to which I would not wish to add anything, even if I could, which I can't, and for which I would not detract anything either. Why would I want to? What I do want to say, though, is that Professor Asma's work poses, behind her work, there is a hugely important question. She holds that there was a foundational, formative, egalitarian Islam, the Islam of the founding moment, and then asks the question, whatever happened to it? Who killed Cock Robin? And it is a hugely important question that can be answered in a number of ways. I would like to attempt to answer it in my own particular and peculiar way, from the kinds of things that interest me, which require, if one wants to answer the question, what happened to it, where did it go to, requires one to pose an earlier question, where did it come from in the first place? And I want to try and answer that question from not Jeffrey's kind, but perhaps my kind of what I call of something that I think I know something about, something that, unlike Dr. Zaki al-Naik, I think I know something about, and that is comparative religion. Now, comparative religion, the study of comparative religion, is not looking at other religions from the standpoint of one's own religion and taking its own preconceptions and presuppositions for granted, and then concluding that all other religions are bad, inferior, stupid, contemptible, the scandalising of other religions, which is what I believe Dr. Zaki al-Naik's work does. That's his basic approach or method. The study of comparative religion requires that one find a standpoint outside of the particular faith traditions that one's discussing, a standpoint that is independent of them, that is impartial between them, that gives them recognition, that honours and respects them, and finds a way of talking about other religions in terms that are not theirs, but which they can accept as offering, amounting to fair, reasonable, intelligent, sympathetic typification of what their faith tradition is about. Now, this is what I do not believe Dr. Zakir Naik does. Some people accuse him of encouraging, jihad, terrorism, extremism. I don't know that I would find him guilty of that. I would accuse him of something else, and something which for me I think is perhaps even worse, which is the offering of unhelpful, prejudicial and scandalising views of other faiths and faith traditions in the name of comparative religion. And even if doing that is not itself terrorism, it is a way of validating, promoting, justifying and giving authority to the kind of thinking upon which exclusivist, militant, radical activism, religious terrorism feeds and thrives. Well, what kind of comparative religion do I want to talk about? I say to do the comparative religion, you have to talk about religions that you understand and for which you have a degree of sympathy. And I admit my own failings and limitations. My understanding and what I talk about mainly, although I used to teach comparative religion as a social and cultural anthropologist long ago that took in absolutely everything, but I talk about comparative religions these days from the point of view of the three Abrahamic faith traditions, the cognate traditions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, the Abrahamic religions, the religions of ethical, prophetic monotheism. And I think all of these three faith traditions they all do their own thing and do it in their own ways, but there's something that they have in common. Each of them, and each in its own ways, generates this notion of human universalism, and the other side of the same coin, of human moral egalitarianism. And how does this happen? I think this is the huge revolution that the monotheistic faiths introduced. The idea that there is one God in heaven, that God has a law, that law applies to all of us are equally bound by it, all of us stand in the same relation to it, all of us therefore stand in the same relation to the divine requirements, to God's requirements, and to God. And by that very fact, by that exercise, if you were to call it that, this way of thinking generates a profound moral egalitarianism, inclusive, without exception, of all human beings. We are all stand in the same relationship to the divine, to God, to the divine law, divine commandments. Yet, in all of these faith traditions, that notion of moral egalitarianism stands in, I won't say contrast or contradiction, but lives in profound tension with what goes on in the world, with the facts of human social, economic, political, gender, human inequality. And all of the religions, all of those religions are constantly struggling with or revolving around or engaging with the attempt to manage this tension between this matter of this principled notion of the equality of all human beings in principle in the eyes of God, and the fact that here on earth all are not equal. And it's important to highlight the point that this is a religiously generated notion. The idea of human equality is not the product of human beings meeting human beings of different kinds saying, gee, shucks, we're all pretty much the same after all. Folks are just folks. It's not the product of empirical research, the evidence of the senses. The idea of human equality, although it is centrally important in the Western tradition to Enlightenment tradition, is not the creature, the creation, the product of the Enlightenment. This notion of the moral equality of all human beings was injected into human history by religion under the authority, under the cover of religion, under the dispensation of religion, under the power of the implications of monotheistic doctrine. And this is a huge human revolution. And so we have to say, well, what about that tension? Now, I think that all of us can recognise, and Professor Asma seems to be quite clear on it in the case of Islam, that foundational egalitarianism has, to a larger degree, been gone or disappeared or been sidelined or been overwhelmed by other things. I would say that in the case of Islam, it has not been totally extirpated. It still lives on. It is characteristic of certain varieties of Sufism. But in a sense, the fact that that's where it lives and thrives, or where it still holds out, shows how marginalised it has become. Let me just, if I had given this lady, a lady in Kelantan who I knew back in 1967, 68, $10 every time I quoted her on this, she would be able to buy herself a new rice field by now. But this is a lady who lived a couple of houses away from where I did in Kelantan in the 1960s, who was a teacher of religion to small children. And Puasa, Ramadan was approaching, and I was thinking, gee, I don't know if I can manage this. And she said, I don't have any doubts. I am looking forward to the fast. That is when we are all truly Muslims, rich and poor alike. We all have to observe the fast. The obligation affects us all equally. That is what the Malay expression, samarata samarasa, the same level, well, in some sense, the same level, the same feeling. Equality generates harmony means. During Puasa, during Ramadan, I have to fast. So too does the Sultan. It's the one thing he can't corvée, he can't kra, he can't pay or commission or hire someone to do for him. That is Islam, and that is Puasa. Here, during Puasa, during Ramadan, she said, the idea of the Islamic society becomes real, and we all live as Muslims in relation to that idealized notion of Islamic society, which comes down to us, and not as we ordinarily do as unequal people. That is Islam. That is why Islam is so refined and advanced. As Muslims, we are all equal, and unlike at other times when many are forgetful of their obligations, Ramadan requires us all to be 100% Muslims. Through our obligations to Allah, we return to the basis of equality with one another in this world. That is what a Muslim society should be, and that is what Puasa, that's what Ramadan reminds us and gives us to it. She said it more or less, it gives us an intimation, it gives us a foretaste of what a proper Islamic society, if we ever had one, would really be like. And I think this is a profound truth. Now, I think that was, in all those faith traditions, in a sense, they start off, the monotheistic faiths, with this, they build upon, they grow from this, an overpowering sense of the immediacy, of the oneness of God, of the immediacy of God, that God is right here near to me, and at the same time is everywhere, is omnipresent. But the question is, what happens to that feeling, that notion, that experiential kind of religion? Where does it go to? Well, it goes away, I think, in all faith traditions for a number of reasons, but primarily because that initial moment passes and the founding prophet, as it were, is no longer there. And people sit around and say, gee, what would the founding prophet have done in this situation now that the prophet is no longer here? And you get then a focus on the prophet. You get then the focus, well, quite clearly in the case of Islam, of deciding what should be done, what might have been done you get the build-up then of the Sunnah, of the Hadith, of law, of Sharia, etc., etc. So you get a shift in religious self-consciousness, in the phenomenology, in the mindset of the believing member of the faith community. The focus goes from God to the Prophet and then to the law of which the Prophet mediated. And in the case of Islam, the religious consciousness, and remember here that Islam lived in the world, expanded, it lived in the world on its own terms largely in most places for 1,000 years. And the focus of the self-understanding of Muslims and many Muslims and of what Islam was about had to do with law, which came to mean state, which came to be power, which came to be governance, with the question of khilafah and dawla. Now we get the word dawla, it has this honorific thing in Malay, you know, dawlat. It's what the sultans have, and you get this modern term, kadawlatan, to express the abstract notion of sovereignty. But basically, as I understand, if you go back to the Arabic etymology, the notion of dawla is again like it is just the turning over, the rolling over, the turning. It's basically about succession. There's nothing particularly grand or honorific about it. It is just the question of the way that power rolls over and rolls from one hand to another. Well, that was we can call that the first form of religious consciousness. What happened then was the clash of civilizations, which happened, and to deny clash of civilizations now should never lead us to think that it hasn't happened. There was this monumental clash of civilizations across the Mediterranean between the world of Islam and the world of Christendom, the Crusades. It was a clash of civilizations then, which is why we should not and must not have one now. We know what the terrible long-term cost of it is. And in the context of that clash of civilizations, the question became a religious one, Muslims upholding the authenticity of the prophethood of Muhammad and Christians denying it in the most scandalizing and offensive ways. And so for that period, much of Muslim consciousness began to became, if you can say it, Muhammad conscious. It was to uphold the authenticity, the dignity of Muhammad as a way of affirming the dignity and status of Islam vis-a-vis militant Christendom. That is another form of in time, summarising a lot of history, the domination that came out of that, the domination of the world of Islam by the world of post-Christian Christendom, the West, came to be challenged. Muslims decided to stand up for themselves and to confront this world. And as they did, a further change in what you could call the phenomenology, the shape, the very shape in the topology of religious consciousness occurred. That what became the focus of the religious and civilizational consciousness of many Muslims was not Islam, was not God, was not the Prophet, was not defending the Prophet, it became Islam itself. Islam itself became the focus of consciousness, which is why in the age, we all now live in the age where it's not just where some forms of Islam are political, but all are political to the extent that we live in a world where Islam itself has become a political cause in a highly politicized world. So what I would want to say in conclusion then is about religious historical consciousness as a way of trying to answer whatever happened to that primary foundational sense of human equality and justice. To understand what the present is about, its inner character, we need to focus not upon the events that produced this new historical reality, but upon the inner transformation or shift of Muslim consciousness, of historical consciousness that it entailed and promoted. It is in that shift, in that newly reoriented consciousness, that the distinctive nature of modern political Islam or modern Islam, 20th and 21st century Islam, in many forms, and the key to understanding the world of Islam today lie. First phase Islam, or Islam of the historically originating and formative era, had its own distinctive form of religious consciousness, its own defining focus, and phenomenological orientation, we might say. It centred upon the primal awareness and overpowering conviction based upon Muhammad's own experiences with the revelation of the unity of God and of God's entire creation, including both the natural world and humankind, under his exclusive divine sovereignty. This became elaborated then, as we said, in terms of state, law, sharia, dawla, and so on. In the wake of crusades and the long polemic over Muhammad that they generated, the next phase of Islam was preoccupied with and came to be defined in its external outlook by the imperative need and obligation to uphold Islam by defending Muhammad, his honour and dignity, and prophetic authenticity, the faith that grew from him. In Islam's most recent phase, a further shift has now occurred. Identification with Islam and its cause has continued and has been renewed, but it is now at the level of historical consciousness, not religious doctrine, an identification with Islam itself as an historical entity, as a complex and historically involved way of life, or din, that of the entire ummah, past and present, who live by that way of life, or who at least, according to the theories of the new Islamist reassertion, ought to do so. It is Islam in this new sense, this new phase, has become the primary focus of widespread Muslim historical identification or point of moral attachment. It is Islam in this sense that has become the phenomenological qibla, we might even say, to speak metaphorically, of the new Islamic consciousness. The religiously based historical consciousness of many Muslims has over the centuries undergone this gradual and subtle shift of orienting or phenomenological focus. A complex line of succession leads from a form of consciousness resting upon the centrality of Allah awareness to one revolving around an obligation, an obligatory solicitousness for the reputation of Muhammad as central to the defence of his true and completed faith, to one driven by the historical impulse to reaffirm and redeem Islam as a way of life, as the way to re-empower the community of true believers and the ummah itself. So in that sense, that, I think, tells us something about that formative religious consciousness, what became of it. It tells us where it came from, it tells us where it's gone to. It's been sidelined in various pockets of the religious tradition, as I say, with some Sufis. It comes out in such moments as with that religious school teacher lady, Quran teacher to little children that I used to know in Kelantan 40, 50 years ago now. The big challenge then is to say, if that is the authentic religious moment, the authentic religious experience, how then is it to be revived and made real and made again central to people's religious awareness and practice in this world, their ways of having the ways of living as Muslims in the world of the 21st century. Thank you.